Gigantium Mysterium. Chapter 2. With all the inhospitable weather of the Gigantium Island, it had made sense to live together in one big building. There weren't other native tribes to worry about in the earlier times, of course. If there had been, perhaps, then they were easily assimilated into Mysterian culture, and their history was still unknown. There had been the original arrivals, the early settlers, the earliest inhabitants, those that had been sent out on the colonial project. They were a far-flung region, a colonial project, those that had gone out and studied and lived and worked and lived in that region. They were a colonial island of a wider parent state. The parent state had lived in a far-flung part of the world, and this was just a colony state of that wider empire. There were a large amount of workers that were sent out to there as part of the company, whether they were sent out to mine and sent out to forest, to farm, to scavenge, and to also forage for as much of the different fauna and flora that could be useful and traded and had some commercial benefit. A large amount of the people, other than the colonial mine farmers and the factory workers, and of course all their families that had gone out there too, and all the different professionals that needed to support them, to sustain themselves, cooks, cleaners, washers, maids, mothers, and of course all the company managers, the executives, the producers and directors, the accountants, secretaries, admin workers, all different workers and professionals at the large enterprising company that was a colonial company that had been sent out. It was really a colonial state, but it had emerged into an adolescent state itself that was still dependent to some extent, but to a lessening extent, on its colonial partner and colonial parent as it was back then. The colonial parent had sent it out long ago, many decades earlier, and it had grown in those many decades, emerging to become an adolescent colonial state itself, still partly dependent on the adult colonial state. The colonial adult state itself still sent more people, resources, and different foods, textiles, and medicines that were needed up to a point, until the adolescent state themselves were able to provide and survive and to produce their own to a greater extent. Even when they couldn't, they could still produce enough other things that they could trade and that were useful in the wider market too themselves, so that they could produce an excess of some things, focusing on specialised knowledge that they were able to do, and that could sustain them in trading to some extent during their adolescent state period. They had emerged as an adolescent state during many, many decades, still dependent on the parent state to a greater extent, on their old colonial parent state, from a land afar. They had all arrived from boats, across the seas, from many distances, travelling great hundreds of miles, in fact, from many different lands to this great Mysteria island, Gigantium Mysteria, as it was then fused and melted into. A large amount of those people were gathered, working and living in different places in the island, but also different houses that they lived in then, living at their enterprising city-state. They had then been forced into the adolescent independence phase, unwittingly, unknowingly, forced into doing this phase that they knew nothing about, where they had to learn a greater degree of independence as an adolescent city, as an adolescent city-state even, that they would later become. The adolescent state, as it would emerge to become, had not yet been that, though. They were adolescent cities still, that had not merged into any kind of state, really. Different disparate cities that were not really connected together that much. Different houses that had not been fused and connected yet either. Then with the loss of the greater, grander parent state, they had then experienced a great change, where they were now forced to be a more emerging adolescent state, or to strive to become an adolescent state themselves, when previously there had been no adolescent state whatsoever. Previously, there had been adolescent houses, and even growing up into hamlets and small villages, enclaves of towns that had begun emerging too, but disconnected from each other. The houses disconnected from one another, hamlets disconnected from each other, villages and towns that were disconnected from each other too. But still, they were having to fuse and merge together to become more dependent on each other now that they were no longer dependent on the outside world, that they could no longer be dependent on their outside parent state, that they were now estranged from, that they were now forced to have to become a united, independent adolescent city state, and not just adolescent, disconnected city towns, city houses, and city peoples. They were now cut off from its parental culture, its parental history, its parental arts, and most important, its parental advice that they missed and needed urgently, but had to depend upon themselves without. They had focused on their internally protecting and preserving themselves within their own buildings, within their own selves, trying to live as independently as they could become. Yet since they had long ago become self-sufficient to a degree, they could now afford to expand. And they expanded their work, their play, their study, and then they expanded especially the work in their mining, in their foresting, reforesting and foraging too of the island. Certainly there was much more reforestations to do, and reminings also. A lot of sculpting projects that were gradually extended, adapted, and extended out in all manner of ways. They also worked on many more of the construction projects themselves that were now targeted and goaled towards fusing and merging themselves, depending on themselves much more, since they were now less able to be dependent on the others, on the parent states that they had once depended on. Now sculpting out their first of their mega quarries and building their first mega structures to fuse themselves and their buildings together, in building their first mega structures and infusing their first mega cities. There were still the native animals, in abundance in some regions. Some were fearsome, predatory even, towards the human inhabitants, the first settlers. They sometimes even stalked the 1,000 miles of the arid, bare desert, the dry lands. They stalked them sometimes alone, but oftentimes in their packs, in their groups, the meandering, wandering hordes that wandered the nocturnal plains of the deserts at night with their infrared vision and the supersonic smells and the motion sensors, sound sensors, and smell sensors too, where they lured down hunting packs of people, tracking them down the lonely, singular dwellings that they targeted. The lonely, singular people, too, were they often targets, singular houses, singular hamlets, even singular towns that could be easily targeted, more than the connected towns, hamlets, villages, or people. Any singular dwellings or singular people could easily be attacked. They could be attacked, ransacked, vandalized, questioned in any manner of animalistic ways. The villages of the deserts, the miners themselves, and the reforesters, when they returned to those villages of their deserts, they often returned to empty houses, destroyed, vandalized houses, or found their partners were being abducted, kidnapped, looked after by other people, foreigners. Sometimes they didn't know who they were before they'd left. Some crazy situation, cries, yells, squeaks, squawks, feathers, bones, leather, skin, fur had all been shoved, pushed, grabbed, and flung about the place so wildly, so fast, before they could really study or know what any of it really meant. They'd been out for so long, for so much of the time, as well, finding their food, scavenging medicine, and all the textiles that were needed, as well as often being out at the mines for long periods of time, many months, or out in the small scrubland, in the small stretches of grassland, in their reforestation projects, or in the long months that they'd be quarrying at the mines, returning to find that everyone had been walled in at the house. They'd stopped outsiders and already had their own internal sealed off walled house for fear of outside predatory animals, some of which were imitating people, even learning to speak like them and imitate and cry like them sometimes too. The animals had ripped up clothes, stolen them, muckying them sometimes, degrading them, making them unwearable, even forcing locals to go naked because they had so few clothes left, where they'd ransack apartments, ripping them to shreds, spoiling and defecating over the clothes too, as if it was some humiliation that they did. They saw no value in the clothes themselves, tossing it about the place. Often the animals never even took the clothes themselves, merely ripped apart the things, especially when there was food wrapped up in the clothes themselves. That's apparently what they were really looking for. But who knew that? With all the rags and the fraying bits and particles left strewn about the place, then they often had to hide away the clothes, lock and seal them up, and those that had no locks had to deep and seal themselves up in clothed and textiled in cases, for fear that the animals would rip apart the few clothes that they still had left. When they were found, they had to go around, sometimes naked, or forced to wear the old same dirty clothes clinging to them, the old rags that had that old stench still attached to it. It was also the custom of those animals to be stealing food oftentimes, or vandalising, leaving a trail of defecation around behind them. Their muddy, mucky, dirty, drabby, yucky stuff, this great stench that smelled so foul, the smeltings as they were called by the locals. Buildings got smelted, whole towns got smelted too, those that hadn't fused together properly, those that hadn't already joined and were in the early stages of megastructuring together, fusing with each other. Their old animal customs of stealing, vandalising, defecating all over city statues, people, buildings, architecture, inside libraries, schools, anywhere they trashed and defecated the place, anywhere they could get in, without having any value for any objects, for any artefacts whatsoever. They saw no historical or cultural meaning or purposes in anything of the humans. Stealing at night often, when the majority had slept, wandering in their packs, slurping and sloping in when the town was sleeping unguarded. All was distracted with many of its great celebrity parties, celebrating some of the great ceremonial occasions, the emergencies of spring, summer, autumn, fall, weddings, birthdays, christenings, and even deaths too, commencing the great events when many were so enumerated, studying and celebrating the great parties, that they were distracted from the creeping, slurping, slithering in animals that could do so quietly at night, so unnoticed. It was felt too dangerous to live alone, really, in such conditions for so long, with so many of these unknown native foreign animals that could get into homes even, lurk inside bedrooms, bathrooms, lounges, anywhere really, under cracks and crevices, the smallest of holes they could slither and sneak within. Really, they could slip through the most unnoticed of places, holes that hadn't even been noticed before, if things weren't fully sealed up. Whole houses, towns, cities had to be fully sealed, cemented and cemented within themselves. Fully cemented in themselves and sealed within, before they could fully catch out and stop all of the other smaller, unknown slithering animals. So many of them had slithered and slimed into the houses, the unknown slithery animals, that they would slip through doors, under doors, or through the cracks within them, through unsealed windows or broken ones, or ones that were left open in the hot, humid, deserty conditions even. They would hop through, crawl, or stagger in, some of them the left open doors. So the doors and windows had to be closed, even in terrific heat waves when one was sweating and desperate for a breeze. Or the windows that were allowed to be opened, or the doors, had to be always manned and guarded, with people watching. Or there were net curtains that had to be draped over everything to filter out the animals and the worst of them. So one often got tangled up in the nets trying to get through sometimes. It often happened. Other animals were strong enough, though, to smash through those nets and to break through, claw, scratch, bite through them even sometimes, stagger through. Some of them were even able to cut through them through unknown influence, through poisons or radars or things that they beamed out of themselves sometimes, cutting through incisors and shapes, things that were not strong enough, so that metal-strong, reinforced doors and windows had to be bolted down at some parts of the days. Other animals were just strong enough to climb up and over the walls that were built themselves, as well as going through some of the unreinforced doors and windows. They could even get through the wood. They could get through the leaves and softer textiles, certainly. Any softer material was very vulnerable to cut through, to slip through the microscopic holes, or they could easily tear through softer fabrics, some of them, with claws in sizes that were so sharp and so numerous, and that could move so swiftly, and that could appear from out of nowhere, out of the darkness, so suddenly. Without strong reinforced doors bolted or guarded when they were opened, and without the metal curtains, the net curtains that were microscopic in their holes, but had chain metal that had microscopic curtains. Those were often used too, but were cumbersome to roll up and down, and difficult to have put up as well. There were so many of these difficult animals to deal with, to adapt their whole buildings and lifestyle to, and so continuously also. They could even smash through the unreinforced sealed doors, if they were made of wood or weaker metals too. Any single glazed windows were smashed through with ease by some of the more voracious animals. At unknown times they could do so. And any hole that was left unfilled in or unguarded could easily be an entry point for some of the more adaptive, thoughtful animals. And there were just so many of them, of all different shapes and sizes, of different strengths and abilities. And they came in different numbers too. Some of them would arrive in hundreds, some just a few, and many just came on their own. Of course, there were the old desert snakes, well known. If they bit you, a few of them at least, not many, but some of them, if they bit you, could be poisonous too, even. The larger ones that didn't go into town, they would go unnoticed, of course, because of their sheer size, taller than several people, and they were very slow at least in getting around, so they could easily be noticed and then confronted by a mob of neighbours, perhaps. Yet, of course, the younger adolescent snakes were much smaller and reasonably much faster than the child snakes themselves, who were very slow to get around, and their poison hadn't really evolved and adapted that much to be that poisonous anyway, to have any real noticeable effect on others. So it was really the adolescent snakes that seemed to be a greater risk to the human population, because they could still go very fast. They were still quite adaptive. They were fairly skilled in their movements, in their slithering abilities to climb and slither up, to hide into small holes, to crawl around and over and around people quickly, and to move fast and swift when needed to, sometimes. And their poison was a little adaptive, though not as much, and certainly not as mature as the adults, nowhere near to that extent. But in sufficient numbers of them, it was possible that they could still infest and cause a small town a terrific problem, where there were hundreds of the smaller adolescent snakes that were crawled in. Often the adult snakes themselves would lay large quantities of their eggs on the edge of the big town, on the big houses. Many of the desert towns were said to be infested with hundreds of the adolescent snake animals that had been born on the outskirts of those towns, where they would secretly give birth to hundreds of these snake elements, those eggs that would be given birth to. But it would take many years before they'd really frutated and grown into proper, more adolescent, mature snakes, where they could really become much of a problem for the people. By then they were too numerous, and they'd become too infested in different parts of the town, in too many houses, gardens, streets, in the areas and the gaps between, the small gapped alleys between the houses, the small streets, the small areas in the between neighbours, between suburbs, between houses, between regions, and between the towns too. All the gaps and the areas between the people is where they hid and lurked in. The gaps between the houses especially, but in the gaps between towns, and between also little hamlets also. All in the gaps they had sizzled in greater numbers, and bred there too. But not just the snakes, there were larger wildcat and wild dog policies too, that roamed through in different areas, and grew in their different numbers too, and grew in their wildness unknown. They were rumoured too, some of the wilder dogs and the wilder cats in older times, rumoured to snatch young children, or to snarl and maul them, to seriously harm or kill them. If caught sneaking into the family house, squeaking through gardens, desperate for food perhaps, wanting to silence children who often played in the gardens unknowingly, and could have raised the neighbouring help, crying out in alarm perhaps. With all the animals that were accused then over the many years, decades even, of attacking, harming, even murdering, but often stealing from, vandalising and defecating on, even abducting people sometimes, although that was never proven. But many of the desert towns had now fortified walls that had been built around them. Yet many animals could dig under those walls themselves, could scurrow or burrow under. And of course, there were many that could fly over themselves, or crawl over, scavenge over, clamber, climb, and somehow leap over. But only few of those could ever really leap. Most flew over, climbed over, scavenged over, dug under, or burrowed over in some way. And then, of course, they had managed to get in once more, even though there were only a few of them. The first few that burrowed under somehow, dug under in their large tunnels, laid the pathway for the others to then follow on behind, where great swaths, hundreds or thousands, could flow through the unknown tunnels until those were blocked up, until there were numerous tunnels that were formed, little holes punctured in the outer lining of the walls, hundreds of holes that would emerge and had to be sealed up with constant vigil guards marching round the walls and exterior. But those became eventual adapted guards. There would be constantly hundreds of them in number, with their jobs of stealing up ever new tunnels that would be emerging within the walls. And sometimes they would emerge some distance away from the walls too, only emerging out from underneath the under pathways, somewhere deeper, further out inside the town itself. So the whole town had to be more vigilant that an under pathway could emerge at any point between houses, between streets, between the towns that were connected together sometimes. Everyone had to become more vengeful and more vigilant as well, looking out to make sure that the animal tunnels didn't just emerge somewhere. Of course, it was easy then to seal up those emerging tunnels, but it was such a large town. If you had a large town, there were lots of places to look to. And if a tunnel entrance of the animals, was hidden somewhere that was never mentioned to, never thought of, somewhere that people just never went to regularly, a part of an allotment that was abandoned by someone that had died a few months ago, for example, the home of a deceased person that hadn't been discovered or visited for a while, a sick person that had no relatives to visit them, those sort of places, an unvisited room that was locked up with instruments that no one wanted or had any use for, storage rooms that grew and gathered dust over many years, perfect breeding grounds on the basement level for the animal tunnels to emerge in. Those sort of places that were scattered throughout the towns, inside unknown houses with unknown people, or people that had unventured into lofts or basements that were just only ever used as storage units that gathered cobwebs and dust, that were thick with unknown insects that lurked down there, that they only went to occasionally when they wanted to retrieve some of the childhood things that they didn't need that often, really, or just things that were only seasonal, very rarely ever really needed. But now the great storage units, all basements, attics, and any other compounds were searched thoroughly, regularly. But those that didn't have the energy, were too sick, were not well, or just didn't have the urgency or the need to know to actually make the regular searches. There were still many unsearched rooms that abounded, unsearched houses and people, places, situations. So many unknown mysteries still persisted that there were still many places around the ground, many lurking places that the animal holes could still emerge in, that the animal outsiders could emerge in a wild, overgrown, unkept garden that had or an unvisited garden from long ago. There were so many options and places that were unexplored in the unknown Mysterian gardens and the Mysterian houses too. And with all the animals that could get in through their various tunnels that constantly had to be searched for, blocked up, sealed, and then they would sometimes be discovered again, multiple tunnels that were nearby or that were some distance from those. At least the inspectors knew that if they found one tunnel of the emerging animals, that they could often find other tunnels that would emerge likely nearby those, offshoots of the underpaths that would then venture out. But those could go for many more miles themselves, and could then come out at a much later place, at a more distant place as well. So wider searches were then later done when no new searches were found, when no new evidence was found of any emerging animal tunnels in a limited area. The searches were then widened to see if they'd then come out of their underground tunnels at a more distant time and place, further out, perhaps a mile upriver, or a mile upstream, a mile uptown, widening the search and the vigilance and the paranoia and fear as well. Even when no new animal tunnels emerged in a vast area, still the searches had to be done just in case an old animal tunnel that hadn't properly been sealed up fully in the miles of labyrinths underground. It took a long time and labour to seal up miles of those, to pump in all the cement and the flow of cement to make sure that they were all fully sealed up and there weren't other offshoots and branch tunnels to parallel tunnels off to one side, as there numerously often were, knowing that they would be cemented in, so that they had numerous parallel tunnels that they could simply go to. If those weren't all fully sealed in and cemented up, then of course those could often lead to other branched off under tunnels that would sprout up and emerge elsewhere. It led to a constant state of having to look and search for where all those different emerging animal tunnels could be, riddled with paranoia, but also with genuine fears and suspicions that they could emerge anywhere and in any unknown place. Now it was possible that they had to try and stop there being all of these unknown places within their town, otherwise it would always remain an unknown place with unknown fears of the emerging animal tunnels that could just emerge out at any place and time, as well as being specifically more likely to emerge in some places. There were the super tunnelers of the animals, of course, as well as the super flyers and the super climbers who got over the walls easily, the super jumpers and the super scramblers who could somehow scramble up the walls as well. So there were those to look out for the visiting guards and also the well-acquainted guards of the security walls. The human guards who had to make sure and keep a firm lookout for the animal climbers around the perimeter of the town walls that they guarded. There were the super climbers to watch out for, and those, of course, the super flyers. They were always being looked out for by the aerial lookers. There were various technology people with telescopes in their towers, always on watch, looking out for the super flying animals that could perch and land on any of the minarets, any of the towers, the steeples, the spires. They could land on any tower, perch on anything, really. And they were always being surveyed for by the aerial watchers, by the aerial towers in their monitoring rooms. The super flyers, of course, were always being observed and looked for, and then the guards were also looking for the super climbers, as well as the super tunnelers and the super scramblers also, surveying and ever watchfully looking for any holes that could emerge, especially near new emerging holes that had recently emerged, and also guarding the perimeters of the actual town walls. All of that took a lot of time and effort and a lot of work, a lot of thought, and a lot of continual effort to maintain the actual equipment and needed to prevent all those animal tunnelings, animal jumpings over the wall, or animal scramblings over it too, as well as preventing all the animal flyers from landing and degrading, infesting, and defecating on so much of the of the people buildings. It took such a lot of effort to do that too. There were lots of other super animals too that they'd noticed, not just the super tunnelers and the super climbers and the super scramblers and the super flyers. Some of those, of course, that were super breeders too, and they easily multiplied in greater and expansive numbers. And the super breeders were especially a problem, therefore, with many multiplying incidents that would happen, of course, many multiplying tunnels, multiplying animals landing on them or climbing, scrambling over walls, those that were the super breeders beyond their walls. The super breeders, especially then, that multiplied so fast, had to be looked out for. Those were multiplying cases of incidents, of so many more assaults that were happening, a rise in the number of assaults that were being reported, that was getting worse and worse. So much so that they had all locked themselves up, away from the invasive animals, this whole breeds and swarms of them, that were breeding themselves in ever greater number, in vaster swarms, in thousands of their underground dens, warrens, nests, hidden up high, or burrowed deeply into the trees, into buildings, mountains, or they buried deeply even into animals themselves sometimes, hidden, animals hidden inside and under each other, sometimes under hilly landscapes, inside the slopes of the hills themselves, sometimes lurking under or within the trees, wild bushes, or sometimes they lurked under rocks in under the sand or under the muddy ground itself. Sometimes they could even bury deeper under rocky grounds themselves, burying under deeper and within all manner of different things, under rocks, trees, mountains, muds, sands, even under some of the animals. They even take shelter under some of the people's houses, as well as within their actual house walls too. Some of the animals lived inside the great, vast, thick walls as well, roaming around within the walls themselves, defecating, breeding, living, making love, fighting and squabbling with each other, and producing mutations of each other within those larger human walls themselves. And where they bred in ever greater mutated numbers, there they were of great concern to the larger numbers of people, emerging in their numerous mutating holes. And of course, the native birds, of course, always flying over the walls, perching on the large minarets, the towers, the spires, all the vast outposts of the buildings, on all of the rooftops that they landed on, that they nested within and under, on the sides and the upper ridges of the building of, nestling out in unventured into rooftops and into storage, dusty attics too, that made great lookout posts, almost as if they were built for them, they'd assumed, where they could sit out there, the birds, perching way up high, chirping their shrilly songs endlessly, that wound up some of the locals, especially, as if the birds up there and the giant mutating birds were somehow taunting them with their weird squawky tunes, squawking out in the early morning, squawking and squawking at them in the morning and evening. It was a fearsome array of different squawks, squacks, and squeaks that squeak, squack, squawked at different times, unpredictable times of the day, that somehow had these weird piercing screams sometimes about them, that annoyed some of the people too, although some people found it an interesting, if eerie, strange spectacle to listen to, hearing some sort of weird, strange songs almost within it, even if it was a horrible, shrieky sort of shrilly sound itself. It almost made a whistly sound in some parts, having a weird, strange bird anatomy to it. The squawky, squeaky, squacky sounds that were really just squawkackering to the people. They were sort of squawkackery songs, squawky songs as they were known as, or squackery songs sometimes. Squawky squackeries really didn't mean much to the people, though. They didn't have any meaning to them, nothing that could be understood. You could know why they were singing. You could know why they were singing, perhaps, if you studied where they were doing it and what time of day they did it, when it seemed to emerge, and when the song actually crescended, when it got worse and louder, or when it got quieter, when more of them chorused together, squawking in unison, or one of them squeaked their solos together. You could learn something about how they did it, perhaps, and what the weird tangled notes were, when they squawked or squawked or squeaked, whatever it was, but you never really knew fully what it was done for, what the purposes were, why they did it at people, or at different places, or at different buildings sometimes, and why so many groups of them seemed to target many groups of different people. It seemed to be quite a mystery to know why it was aimed at them, or what the real meaning of it really was. Many thought that the birds were trying to taunt them, annoy them, or to upset them, or to somehow remind them of something they could never obtain. Many thought that it was a warning, a signal, but weren't sure always what it was too, as some sort of call, because many of them would leave after a quick squawk song, but many others it was not that. and for many others the corkscrongs were long and drawn-out affairs. But still they were mellow, and they were very melancholy and sorrowful and sad almost, and no one was quite sure why or what they were sorry about. But nevertheless there were many happy of the squawky songs chirping away, but therefore people weren't always sure why those were happier too, because they could occur in horrible, grimy, miserable, ugly places, places that hadn't seen any real happiness for a long time, yet nevertheless were visited by happy, joyful, chirpy birds that had chirping songs, chippy chirping their way along, with long merry songs that seemed merry enough, but there never seemed to be any reason or understanding about why they were like that, neither why they were miserable in their song, if they were squacky, squawky, squeaky, and fearsome sometimes, but sad in many other squawking songs, or if they chirped their happy songs that they did in harmony, in melody, in a wonderfully sounding orchestra of songs. No one ever was sure why they were happy, or in what way, what had made them that, and why they were like that. No one was quite sure, of the new humans at least. Though the bird creatures, however advanced in their bird songs they were, in their happier songs and their sad, melancholic songs, still they themselves weren't any real threat to the people. Even the gigantium birds themselves weren't any real threat. They merely perched observantly on towering minarets up high in the sky that pierced the sky, or the lower clouds of it too, standing in the great wafts floating by, where they were bathed in the clouds themselves, staring down with their piercing eyes on high. The great gigantium birds perched on the high towers, staring down at the people below, that never grabbed them and flew off with them to giant mountains, didn't do anything like that at all, that just merely observed on their stationary platforms way up high, staring sternly way down below, or with no discernible face, even looking back up to them through the giant telescopic beams. One could never make out or see or discern any real identity, not any personal expression on their face. It was as if they were objective or staring out poker-faced, unable to really read their expression or what their purpose in observing the humans was. But yet those gigantian birds had never attacked the people, not in any meaningful way. No records of it anyway. Merely perched on the towers, then did their observations before flying away. Or sometimes they weren't seen observing the people if there was a great waft of passing clouds, if all the towers were bathed in a mass of clouds that were dark or for the telescopes to really see much through the mirage of. So there was no fear of the giant birds whatsoever, especially the smaller birds that came to rest on the lower parts of the building. Although the smaller birds that entered into some of the attics where they could creep through, scuttle through, or fly through sometimes. Those that nested and rested on the small enclaves under and around the rooftops, or on the outpost buildings, on their rooftops too. Those were a milder nuisance, defecating on, into, and around the buildings, even if they were unvisited parts of the buildings, the high-up attics often as they were, that were shooed away and pushed off sometimes, discouraged from visiting, though those also were no real threats, no real vigilant menace, had no real terrible design on people. They didn't eat people, they didn't hunt people, and they weren't a real serious menace to people, even if they were an annoyance to people sometimes, the smaller birds. Some of the other, and many of the other smaller animals of the Gigantian island, however, were more of a threat to people sometimes. Those that had once hunted people, that had targeted people, tracked people down, snared them, that captured them for their clothing, for their food, or just for the store of them, even if they just needed them for some other purpose, some unknown purpose that the people knew little to nothing of, could only speculate on the needs of the animals that they knew little about. It was really an unknown amount of Mysterian animals that had existed in the Gigantian Islands. But there were so many with so many different abilities. But many of those animals were not to be feared, even if there were few that were to be guarded against, those that were predatory to people, and that could also mutate fast, that could burrow under and through walls, live within them even, and there would seem to be some sort of danger to the persons themselves. Even if the birds weren't, many of the smaller animals absolutely were, and those were, whether they were snake animals, rodent animals, or mammalian animals, or many other types of animals, they were certainly guarded against by the people, though you could never know why they were doing many of the things that they were, of course. It took a long time to study of them, and even after great longitudinal studies, still many great mysteries of those animals persisted. The Mega Mansioneer and the Mega Mansion really was just a simple construction project. What was really just endless rows of connecting terraced houses, and there were different rows in a different grid system. They were all merged and melted, fused together in large, great grid blocks. There were large gridded blocks of multiple houses. 3 or 4 houses at first fused together, then a dozen, then there would be hundreds that had all fused together in a huge mansion, before lots of mansions all fused together themselves, with no giant green estates between them, no gardens between them anymore, large estates that had all fused together, giant mansions fused together into the first of the smallest, the dwarf mega mansions, as they were later called. These were real giant mansions, each that could house hundreds of people, and each of the mansions fused together, so that there were no great long estates, there were no long lawns, no long gardens, and no long lanes or tracks or pathways between them any more. Merely they were just endless rows of buildings, different kinds of buildings with different kinds of rooms, many hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of rooms within them. There could be hundreds of rooms in each of the mansions, and then when those were fused together into the small mega mansions, then those ones had many thousands of rooms within them, could house tens of thousands of people as well then. Those were just the small, earliest mega mansions. The small mega mansions, really. What was the small brothers and sisters, the small siblings of the later great mega mansion, of the old mega mansion, as it would appear. The mega mansion, perhaps. Those mega mansions were just simplistically fused together buildings that always added, adapted, and extended their actual constructions. The different islands of buildings that had gradually merged together, assimilated into each other. And even streets that had then conjoined together. The streets themselves that were built on, under, over, and that connected houses that had once opposed together, so that bridge houses formed, and that the bridges grew thicker, wider, deeper, and grew out in different directions, so that what started as a thin bridge between two different estates, buildings, or structures, that gradually built out further on either side, becoming ever thicker, expanding further outwards, wider, and growing up taller, and growing out wider and broader, so that it expanded, the different rooms and buildings attaching to it growing out, so that a thin wall had become a vast thick wall, a thick wall that could be perhaps half a mile thick in its broadness, and could be a great long length, any length indeed, any number of different lengths, according to its different needs and abilities. These long fused mega construction projects had grown bigger and bigger as they were surrounded by the snowstorms, by the sandstorms themselves of the vast arid deserts that sometimes sanded in whole towns as well, that it took weeks and months to dig oneself out of, and that it helped to have others to dig out as well, so that the sandstorms didn't sand in whole towns and leave a whole town or town remoted. Remote cities could struggle much more. Remote people struggled in the sandstorms. Remote towns certainly struggled much more. Remote villages and hamlets wiped out long ago, buried deeply under the sandstorms, as remote people that lived isolated were. Many decades ago, that had been eliminated. No one could have survived the sandstorms living alone with sufficient materials, with sufficient resources, food, textiles, medicines, metals, minerals, nutrients. No one could have subsided and lived alone as well, mentally, physically, nutritionally, psychologically, as well as also physiologically, sustaining themselves for that many decades during the many intense sandstorms. They were often mild, but occasionally severe in their nature, and could bury deeply, many meters, quite regularly over the decades, burying a town many meters deep in sand, and over many years without being able to dig oneself out regularly. Easily, one could be dug under, one could be dug in, and one could be buried deeply within these vast, great sandstorms. Lots of hamlets and villages and towns of the older world had been buried long ago, deeply under the sand. And really only the towns that had fused and merged into megastructures, depending on each other and not only on themselves, had really endured, survived all the long decades of the sandstorming. Even when you could dig yourself out in a small house on its own, or hamlet on its own, a village on its own, or a town or city on its own, then even when you could dig yourself out fine and you had enough resources to endure a few weeks or a few months and to be able to cope for a limited amount of time to withstand a limited amount of the severe sandstormers, even then though, still, you wouldn't be able to endure that much of it, and eventually you'd be sandstormed in at too much. And then there were all the other animals that could slip in or that were already homed in with you, that were sandstormed in with you for that duration. Those various other animals, the super breeders, the super scurriers, the super climbers, the super scramblers, and also the other super attackers too. Those that were a super risk to humans as well. The super defecators especially, that have gotten everywhere and seemed to sort of penetrate everything, gotten into the houses, the walls, and even between them, the buildings, and gotten into the furniture, into the possessions, the objects, the machinery. That really all needed to be treated, that really needed to be cleaned and kept pristine, away from the infectious animals that there had been amassing and growing and expanding in their numbers. So, with such treatment programs needed and it being easier for larger numbers to be treated, then rather than be infected by others, it was much better then to have a larger group of people that were already treated and had access to the treatment themselves, and that could stand up against the infectious animals that were posing a greater infectious risk to the people also, because the greater number of treatments were now needed. And to have access to a greater number of treatments meant having access to a greater number of people as well, because it took a lot of people to really administer those treatments well, to help each other administer them, to monitor each other's treatments, to care for each other's treatments, because it was difficult to administer your own treatments if you were affected yourself by any number of the infectious animals that there were. So there were a lot of problems, and many people were needed to adapt to defend themselves against the infectious animals, to treat all the buildings, as well as to treat each other. The treaters had to be grown in vaster numbers, and there were more people than there were to treat each other, as well as to treat the furniture, the buildings, the cities themselves, and some of the animals that could be treated too, those that were of use, those that were befriended, the domestic animals that provided some service to the people too. Greater numbers of people were needed, but also greater numbers of treatments, greater numbers of administrators of the treatments too that had been needed. So it makes sense to endure and survive not just the worst of the sandstorms, but also the infectious animals too, to have a superstructure that one could be treated within. When the super treatments had emerged, to help to treat all the great numbers of people that were being infected by the greater number of the infectious animals that were spreading the super infections all over the different regions of the island of Gigantium. Great towns were being infected by it, but it was hard for them to actually treat themselves of it. Hard for a single person to do all the treatment themselves of all their whole building, of their machinery, of their car, of their whole garden, of all their plants in their garden, the ones that needed it, of all their animals, the domestic animals that had to be done, their livestock, of all their pets inside the house, to treat their own family members, to treat themselves and their different parts of their own body, to treat their hair, their scalp, their face, their internal organs, if it was needed, but also to treat their furniture, the building, parts of the other objects that had been infected too. They had to treat all the tables and chairs, to treat their own food, to treat their own medicines that could become infected by it too. Treating even the machinery, the domestic animals, the other people that lived within them. It was too much work for one person to do all that, to administer the treatment, to research and know the exact treatment for the strain of diseases that needed treated, to research and know the exact treatments for the whole house, for all of the possessions, the objects, the machines, for all of the different foods, the textiles, the fabrics, the furniture, and the different peoples and animals, and all of the things within one's own house was just too much to do for one person. It needed too much research, too much knowledge, too much physical abilities that were needed for many as well, in actually physically managing to treat the different furniture, to treat the walls of wood rot, to stop the infestation of the wooden walls, or the infestation of wooden buildings, the infestation of the wooden support beams of the actual building. The wood could be infested as well as the fabrics, all manner of things, even the books could be. To treat all of those books, films, music, records, and all of the different things. The different clothing, of course, especially the clothes that you wore and the clothing that all of the family members in the house slept in. It was not too much to research and to administer the treatments of all of those things, of all of the different ways of doing the treatments and the different types of treatment that there were too. So to really do that took many people to do the different research together and also to do the treatments together as well. Lots of people treated the animals, their own animals, domestic and their pets too. They treated their own house together, treating the furniture together, treating all different parts of the house together, so they could apply the treatments for each other, with each other, by each other. So it was easier then to do treatment programs together, to administer treatments, register treatments, study treatments, and or even experiment treatments, and even care for each other in treatments together, rather than people doing it remotely, alone, isolated, scattered. Especially in the early days, those that had suffered alone, who were too young or too old, people that were mentally ill, people that had already long-term physical diseases, other infections, other injuries, that had other long-term conditions as well, people that were very too old, had too long mental illnesses, as well as physical illnesses, emotional illnesses, social illnesses as well. Those that had multiple other conditions could not live alone and survive in a remote alone condition in a remote house. Those alone houses left long ago and could not survive enduring long waves and decades of the sandstorming and of all the waves of the different animals to be vigilant against, especially the waves of the infectious animals they had to guard themselves and the house and their own people against. So had grown up all the different mega constructions and their mega needs with their mega treatment programs, guarding against the mega diseases with the mega infectious animals that had spread through the island of Gigantium. The need for the mega structures was many, not just for the mega programs, and mega entertainment, of course, was a part of it, as well as two mega socializing, mega families that spread out and spawned hundreds of different members that still wanted to be connected to each other, groups of mega friendships. There were also thousands many. There were mega temples, mega churches, mega mosques, mega buildings, mega shopping centres too, mega commercial enterprises too, not just the mega mines and the mega quarries. There were also the mega woodlands as well, giant great woodlands that had been reforested, regreened, and that were being adapted and extended, sprawl out greening terraces, bushes, wildernesses in all different directions. It was seen as being advantageous to have a better community that you could work to join a mega hospital that was part of giving out mega programs, administering mega treatments to those mega infections, possibly from the mega animals, or perhaps from other sources also. giving also with mega doctors and mega who could also look after mega amounts of patients, vast amounts of patients who could only be treated with specialized amounts of knowledge, specialized equipment that was needed in that specific specialized mega structure world, in the mega hospital, the mega hospice, for example, or perhaps some special equipment that was only needed, that could only be obtained in the specialist mega gym or the specialist mega science laboratories, or even the specialist mega laboratories of the university, or any of the other great many mega structures that there were that required very specific mega structure equipment and mega structure understanding of the mega structured people. There are a great many needs to have those mega structures in the early days, and make great many desires to have an insular contact structure that was dedicated to very one purpose, that was centralized in its application of pushing forward a particular design, that was centered around a very specific need and desire that a whole community had desired and wanted and thrived for too. Whether it was for a treatment program or merely to enjoy themselves, to socialize, to shop, to commercialize, or whether it was a love of mining, quarrying, singing, art, or a whole variety of many other things besides. People that were unified within a structure of something wanted a unifying structure to represent that too, so that a recognized unified group of people that were working together on a unified project wanted a unified building that was properly unifying, melted and merged together fully. If the group were themselves, then it was desirable in many ways. In the earlier days, it was very different, and things had changed much over the time. Most of the island was still wild, though, and had not been regreened, had not been merged and melted into these mega structures. There were not these great spores of megalopian, not these great vast spores of megastructures, not the emporium of emporiums, and not great emporiums that had great megastructures with mega bridges connecting their mega worlds. There were no such things in the old world. But now there were those things. There were still parts of the old world between those things now. There were still great stretches of still younger, smaller forests and towns and peoples as well. There were more disconnected people, more disconnected towns that had a great many spaces between the houses, between the towns, between the cities, between the nations and the empires too that they housed. Between all the different things. What's in the forest themselves, all the plants grew up over, around, led on top of each other. They grew over and under each other, led over each other, and led on top of each other. They rested on each other, they competed on each other. But they grew over and around, depended on each other. There were no gaps and spaces on them, essentially, or only small if they were. But the people in the constructions had larger great spaces between them, between their towns, between their houses, even between their suburbs there were too, and between the different districts of the different types of suburbs that they had, between the different regions, even between the different towns especially, there were great differences.